There are a lot of things I used to think about as a Christian that I don't really think about anymore as an Omnist. But sometimes I find it's really useful to look back on them because they were a part of the process. As I've often said, it's not as if I became an Omnist because I looked at a big list of religions and thought, oh, I'll take that really complicated one. You know, the one that kind of requires me to study everything. No, it was a step-by-step process. And sometimes it's interesting to look back on those precise steps and try to realize how they happened. I remember when I was pretty young, the thought of the Ark of Noah was rather interesting to me. Because when you're a child and they're telling you the story, it's just a cool story. You know, this guy builds this giant boat and he puts all the animals on it and they survived the great flood that covered the entire world. As you grow older and you get, say, into your teens and you start learning about certain things, it starts seeming a little problematic. And there were a lot of ways I used to think about it because I very much was raised in this extremely conservative Christian background that looked at everything very literally. And when you come from that background, the steps you take are very literal. For instance, at first I found it really fascinating that almost every religion in the world had some kind of a flood story. Some point in time where the entire world was covered in water and somehow someone survived with all the animals. Or different aspects of that, different ways. Some of them didn't even include the animals, some of them did. The Chinese have a story very, very similar to the Christian story where I think even the same number of people were on board the boat. It was really intriguing. But then you have some, let's say, American Native stories where someone survived it in a high mountain, in a cave, or what have you. And I found that really interesting at first because I thought, wow, this is great. There's evidence for the flood all over the place in all kinds of religions. But then you run into, well, yeah, but why is it that all the stories are different? Some of them being very similar, yes, and possibly referring to the exact same thing, but at the same time, there are the ones like the one up in the cave. And the first thing I came to was this thought that, well, okay, anyone in a flood, anyone in a massive flood where the flood covers everything, and they survive, whatever way they survive, is going to think they're the only survivor, right? And it wouldn't be odd for someone to write the story and say, oh, well, you know, me and my family were the only survivors in the entire world. At that time, it's not exactly like anyone even had any idea how big the world was. So that wasn't terribly surprising. Then I started finding more and more problems. Like you started looking at Australia. And Australia has these animals that have evolved in a completely different way than the rest of the world. And there's really no good way of explaining how those animals could have possibly come from anywhere else. And not, or at least not have been somewhere else. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So more and more thoughts go into it. I remember reading about floods and how there were large chunks of the world that did get covered in various floods, did get covered in ice ages and all these different concepts that have theoretically occurred. And as a person who very much certainly loved science, even when I was a child, but someone who also believed very fervently in these Christian concepts, had to try and make sense of them. So, of course, I thought, well, you know, it's interesting when you think about that. Chunks of the earth were covered in water. So if anyone went through something like that, again, they would think the whole world was covered in water. It is entirely possible that those flood stories do come, not necessarily from the same flood, but a group of people went through this or went through that, and they wrote about it in their stories and their histories. I have not, I do not in any way throw away the stories of holy writings or the Bible any of them. I think very often they are based on true accounts and true things. And to me, you don't have to throw out the whole thing just because because part of it doesn't make sense to you, or because some of it seems heavily mythological. In looking at that, it was part of the way that I started seeing patterns in other people's religions, patterns in the fact that other people believe the same things. And even though I didn't necessarily have to come to a perfect conclusion, even though I didn't have to come to some kind of a conclusion where Christians were right, and indeed I came to more of a conclusion where everyone was right, that was part of what led me to the omnistic belief systems I have today. And I think they're very interesting. I don't think it's necessary to believe in things in the way that I used to. And I say that for reasons even reasons of salvation. Part of the reason that a lot of religions that believe so, or let me say the more conservative branches of religions believe things the way they do, is because they do feel, even as illogical as it may sound, that Noah was this very literal person who literally put all the animals onto one boat and survived this massive flood. Even though that may seem somewhat ridiculous, if it's not true, then Jesus isn't true, God isn't true, heaven isn't true. And everything becomes irrelevant, because to some people it's very much an all or nothing prospect. But for me it's not. It doesn't have to be that literal. And I think if that's where you need to stop, that's okay. Some people just say, okay, I don't know. I don't know how that thing could have been true, but I just feel it's true. I need to feel it's true, because if it's true, something else is true, and everything is true, etc., etc. And that's fine. I'm certainly not against that. It's not the way my mind works, but that's okay, because it's still all terribly important, and all of those connections are important. And I think that looking at myth that way, and again, I'm not saying myth in a derogatory way. Myth just means story. It just means a story that is used to understand the past. And there's plenty of myths in our culture that have nothing to do with biblical writings. You know, as I've said before, you know, Abraham Lincoln is a myth. But we'll get into that in another video. Anyway, for the moment, I am the Urban Omnist, forever looking at other religions in some pretty strange ways. I'll see you guys in the next one.